You are listening to the Final Say Radio Show, a Rappaport Media production, with your host Brett Rappaport and co-host John Rappaport.
Well, John, I want to welcome our first guest today and of the week, Gordon Chang, a great contributor to Forbes.com and a policy expert on China, Asia, and nuclear proliferation. Gordon, it's a pleasure to have you back on the program with John and Brett Rappaport.
Thank you so much.
Well, Gordon, I was reviewing some of your recent articles, and it is interesting to me, and I'd love to find out more of, well, first we'll go to your more recent article from Forbes.com, and that is why China, and not just China, but other countries, but specifically China, have been buying up so much gold recently.
It's really interesting. You know, with the plunge in gold prices this month, there has been some buying because of people wanting to take advantage of the price dip. But in China's case, it appears that the people there are buying it not only because they want to get a good deal, but they also very concerned about the trajectory of their own economy. And it's not just inflation, which is something that, you know, drives many people around the world to buy the shiny yellow metal, but it's a real concern about the Chinese economy failing. Instead of having the 7.7% growth that Beijing claims for the first quarter this year, it looks like growth was 3 or 4%. And when you take out economically useless production, then the number was even lower than that. So I think that what's happening right now are that people in China are starting to understand how bad their economy is.
That's very interesting. Now, you've been writing about this. You felt that the Chinese economy for some time is ready to really start turning backward and slowing down at the very least. But your article just before that was discussing about some of the global banks starting to divorce themselves from China, and I think these two are related.
Well, they certainly are. You know, it's interesting that HSBC, which used to be known as Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, has had a 100% commitment to China if you go back 2 years ago. But recently, it's interesting because they've started to divest Chinese assets, and analysts are expecting them to drop a few more of them, which is stunning because nobody ever thought that HSBC would want to lessen its China exposure, and yet they've been doing it, as other international banks have started to do so, because of these tie-ups between foreign and domestic banks have not worked out. They have not helped the foreign banks penetrate the Chinese banking and financial industry. So clearly right now what you have is a reassessment going on around the world about whether these investments into China are making sense.
Now, one last thing, and we've discussed this with you in the past, and that is the housing market in China and also the amount of loans, the debt on the books, both related to housing and government spending in China. And I think that also, too, plays into this discussion.
Well, it certainly does, because right now you have the Chinese economy has an end-of-cycle feel to it because there's too much debt. To keep the economy growing after the global downturn in 2008, Chinese leaders went on a massive stimulus program, which made us really look like amateurs. They poured about $1.1 trillion of stimulus in 2009, and that was into an economy which was then about $4.3 trillion economy. So this is an incredible stimulus program, much bigger than anything that the Bush or the Obama administrations ever tried. And so they created growth in China, but they also created dislocations. They created asset bubbles, construction bubble, and they've created a lot of debt. And they really don't know what to do right now. When they had the downturn in growth starting at the middle of 2011, Chinese leaders didn't allow the economy to adjust. What they did was they again poured more stimulus into the economy, building more steel mills and other sorts of things that basically the country didn't need. And so that's really been the issue of these ghost cities, high-speed rail lines to nowhere. And my wife and I saw this last month when we went back to my dad's hometown, which had been totally transformed with apartment blocks and skyscrapers and NFL-sized stadiums, but no people.
Oh, that's very interesting. So how if we looked at Japan and South Korea and some of the other smaller nations in that region, how are the other economies viewing what's going on in China, and is there any impact on their economies with these revelations?
Well, there will be impact on these economies. They already have to a certain extent because they trade with China. South Korea is relatively viable right now. It's healthy. And although the economy is not going as strong as it used to be, it nonetheless is acceptable. Japan is the real big issue because new Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has now embarked on a very bold stimulus program of his own. He basically wants to essentially cheapen the yen, and he's been driving the yen down, which has been driving countries in the region crazy because now Japanese exporters are much more competitive, and he's also trying to increase the money supply dramatically by doubling it in a couple of years. And this is really quite an interesting experiment. If it doesn't work, there's going to be real problems for Japan.
Gordon, when you look at the overall rankings of banks last year, it's kind of shocking, actually, that the top U.S. banks are J.P. Morgan Chase and Bank of America at numbers 9 and 10, and, of course, China at number 1, and then again at slots 13, 14, 15, and a few more down the road. So clearly their impact could be quite significant. But it would seem to me that because China has been proven not to be an honest broker, and it seems like most countries trade with them by necessity versus desire, do you expect that there will be a continued distrust? In other words, people will be looking for a reason to divest from working with China or major banks, et cetera, simply because they don't trust them, and not just as an honest broker, but even in terms of theft and intelligence. When you look at a sector like banking, information that is required to do loans and things like that, it's a tremendous amount of disclosure and discovery, and would put anybody at risk when that banker, could be deemed an honest broker / agent of the government.
Yeah, in China right now, if you look at the ranking of the top 10 banks, and I haven't done this in a little while, but you see about 6 or 7 of them, if you look at it by assets, are Chinese. And this actually is quite stunning. But we got to remember in the 1980s, all the world's 10 largest banks were Japanese. All the 4 biggest securities houses were Japanese. And so what China has done is it's increased the assets of these banks by letting them go on lending binges. But the problem is that the borrowers are not really creditworthy. And so the books of the Chinese banks, where it should show 1% non-performing loan ratios, which are really low, it's just completely unbelievable. The real non-performing loan ratios of the Chinese banks are probably 10, 11, 12. And if you adopt even more realistic positions, maybe as a quarter of the loans in the Chinese banks are now questionable. To answer your question earlier, you asked about whether people would be looking to divest from China. I actually think that they're looking for reasons to invest. Because they really do buy into the Chinese miracle stories. But we're seeing a lot of them have real concerns about what's going on. And although they'd like to be there, I think that we're starting to see a change in attitude as basically all sorts of companies are having difficulties in China that people did not expect just 3-4 years ago. Now, one of the questions that comes to mind given the discussion we just had about gold, is wealth flight risks. So if you look at China and you consider the amount of new wealth that was created, right, much like we've often discussed the oligarchs coming out of Russia, there's some fabulously wealthy people in China, and many of them are buying up real estate in the U.S. and elsewhere. Do you see that as a wise investment practice, or do you think that there's some degree of hedging against potential instability within their own country? Well, there's not only hedging against instability, but we see a lot of Chinese investment outside of China because they don't see the opportunities in their own economy. We outsiders look at China and say, oh, it's growing, it's going to take over the world, they're going to have the biggest economy by 2016. Well, that's sort of ridiculous when you look at what big Chinese companies are doing. If that were true, big Chinese companies would not be investing in regions with much lower rates of growth than China, supposedly. They would be staying at home where they wouldn't have that risk, where they'd have much more opportunity to use their market clout to make money. The fact that Chinese companies are investing abroad really shows that they don't have faith in their own economy. And that's why they're accepting greater risk, in a sense, of investing in unknown locations, even with much lower rates of return projected, because they know that at the end of the day, that's a better investment than in putting money into their own country.
Well said. Well, because it's noteworthy that investing abroad, especially if you're talking about individual assets, has a greater level of complexity. Gordon, I want to switch a little bit to the borders, if I may. And you had an article that you wrote about a week ago regarding India and the Chinese border. And that, to me, is just such a fascinating subject, because if you look at India and China, given their population, given their mass size and scale and resources and their growth trajectories, and given their proximity to each other, boy, what an interesting dynamic, whether they're cooperating or they're worse, seeing each other as global rivals and adversaries, both economically and potentially militarily, is as it seems to me, it's as profound in the next 100 years as the battle between the Soviet Union and the U.S. was in the last century. So can you give us your sense of what's going on between China and India and what our listeners can learn from this?
Well, the night of April 15th, a platoon-sized force of Chinese troops, aided by helicopters, intruded into Indian territory about 10 kilometers and established a camp. This was south of the line of actual control in a place called Ladakh, where the border is not exactly fixed. Everyone thought that the Chinese were just going to stay there for a few days and then leave, but they haven't. They're still there. And in fact, on Friday it was revealed that the Chinese troops moved at least another 9 kilometers into Indian territory. And this has created a standoff because the Indians have created their own camp somewhere between 300 to 500 meters away from the Chinese one. And right now, the Chinese seem to be reinforcing their camp. This is aggression. Hundreds of times a year, the Chinese will move into Indian-controlled territory, and they will leave sort of a marker, like they'll paint stones red, or they'll just leave trash. This time, for the first time since about the middle of the 1980s, they're actually sticking around. And this is creating a crisis. Even though relations between New Delhi and Beijing were said to be good, and even though Chinese Premier Li Keqiang is supposed to visit New Delhi soon, the Chinese are engaging in very aggressive tactics.
Yeah, this is very interesting, and I think you pointed out very nicely that this isn't something that's not familiar, either Indian troops going over the border into China or Chinese troops going into India. But what is starkly different, of course, is that they're actually setting up camp here. And the question I'd have for you is, how long are they able to stay there? Are the supply lines adequate for them to stay there? And have the Chinese reached out to India in any way in any kind of talks, looking for concessions, if you will, or are they laying any claim?
Well, this is disputed territory, but they have a line of actual control, which they have agreed to, and the Chinese are clearly on the Indian side of that line. The Indians have been the ones reaching out to the Chinese to try to talk them out of Indian-controlled territory, but so far it hasn't worked. And the Chinese have actually got the infrastructure to try to reinforce this. So what we're going to see is, I think, a prolonged standoff. And this is going to be really unfortunate because this is just another instance of Chinese aggression.
Okay. So what's the next step for India? Do they go to the United Nations? Is this something a legal matter for the world courts? Have they reached out to the United States to try to broker some sort of a negotiation?
Well, the Indians aren't going to do that. Their conception of themselves as a great power means that they're not going to ask for help from anyone, including us. They're sending their foreign minister to Beijing to try to negotiate an end to this. But I don't know if that's going to work. They've already had 2 meetings between the flag officers of each side, and those have been inconclusive, not getting any progress. We just got to wait to see how this thing ends, but this could get really ugly. And this is occurring at the same time that the Chinese are intruding on the Japanese waters in the East China Sea, and the Chinese are engaging in other maneuvers to try to take islands in the South China Sea. So this is not an isolated incident. Last week was a really good one if you were a belligerent Beijing aggressor.
Oh, yeah. And what's interesting about last week is that, we were all focused on what happened in Boston and some of the other issues around the world. We're concerned with, of course, what's going on in Syria, the Iranian red line, and I think we're very quick to forget, one, the cybersecurity issues, and two, the aggression by the Chinese military.
Yeah, it happens all at the same time, and we should not expect that Iran, North Korea, Syria, China, even Russia will sort of say, oh, you can only absorb one crisis at a time, so we'll hold off on the rest of them. Well, of course they are challenging us across a broad front, sequester or no sequester. This is just the way that these countries act. Sometimes they act in coordination, sometimes they don't, but they all try to take advantage of the situation, and that's exactly what's happening. And it is not inconceivable that a year from now the world is going to look entirely different from it is today, and that all the assumptions that we have about the way life goes on will just be proven incorrect.
Gordon, I don't know if you ever do this personally, but do you ever pay attention to the news cycles to see if there's a pattern of distraction? So in other words, in the American news cycle, we get a bombing or sometimes even just a sad child disappearing story that overwhelms the news cycle for an entire week 24/7. And it would seem to me that because we're so easily distracted from world affairs that it's very easy for countries like China to take advantage of that gap and choosing that to be the opportunity to engage in malfeasance.
Well, right now, Chinese moves to expand its territory have been just all the time. So you can't really see a pattern, except the pattern is that they're engaging in this, almost every other day. So it's not really time to, for instance, the Boston Marathon bombing, or things like Natalie Holloway, for instance. I mean, this has just been consistent. And, we've seen the North Koreans and the Iranians essentially work together. Because the Iranians, every time that they see that we have a feeble response to North Korean provocations, they interpret that to be a big green light for their own ambitions. And so they don't really need to coordinate by saying, calling up one another and saying, we're going to do this tomorrow so you can do this the day after. They just actually see what each other is doing. And so they are acting at a time where they think there's opportunity. They think the United States is distracted, doesn't have leadership, is not going to show any resolve. And so they figure that they can really make a lot of progress. And this is the way things have worked. Democracies very much are reluctant to confront problems until they get to the point where they have absolutely no choice. And we're headed down a very, very dangerous path right now.
Well, I think that's well said. We basically, I'm sorry, I was just going to comment quickly. We always seem to want to wait till like a stage 3 cancer instead of getting it when it's just a pimple. Anyway, I'll let Brett wrap up with you.
Yeah, I agree with you completely on your last statement, Gordon, and I'm very fearful of what the next year is going to be like because there are too many fires across the continents, and I'm not sure that their assessment of our leadership is incorrect. So I don't know. I guess we could hope for the best, and be prepared for the worst.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we should always do. Let's keep the gunpowder dry because clearly the bad guys right now have decided that this is a moment of opportunity, and they are acting in ways which could destabilize the world for generations.
That's right. Gordon Chang with Forbes.com. It's always a pleasure to have you join us with such great insight on all these issues, so thank you again.
Thank you.
All right, take care. That's Gordon Chang with Forbes.com.